50,000 Japanese soldiers hunted one American officer across an island the size of South Korea. They offered rewards. They burned villages. They executed civilians by the hundreds. For 3 years, they never caught him. Instead, he built an army of 30,000 fighters, established a functioning government, printed his own currency, and turned their occupation into a strategic nightmare. His name was Wendell Fertig, and before the war ended, he would become the man who made an empire bleed. The jungle swallowed him on the 10th of May, 1942. Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Fertig, a mining engineer turned reserve officer, stood at the edge of the forest on Mindanao and made a decision that would alter the course of the Pacific War. Behind him, the United States Army in the Philippines was collapsing. General Jonathan Wainwright had surrendered all American forces in the archipelago. The Bataan Death March had already entered history as an atrocity. Manila had fallen. Corregidor had fallen. The flag was coming down across thousands of miles of islands, and the order was clear. Lay down your arms, burn your supplies, and march into captivity. Fertig looked at that order, looked at the mountains rising into the clouds, and walked away from everything he had been trained to do. He did not surrender. He did not burn his weapons. He simply disappeared. Mindanao was not like the rest of the Philippines. It was a world unto itself, a sprawling mass of volcanic peaks, impenetrable rainforest, and coastal plains where a dozen different peoples lived in uneasy proximity. The northern coast held Christian Filipinos, descendants of centuries of Spanish colonization, who farmed rice and fished the Mindanao Sea. The interior mountains belonged to the Lumad peoples, tribal groups who had resisted every empire that ever tried to claim them. The southern and western coasts were dominated by the Moro Muslim sultanates whose warriors had fought the Spanish for 300 years and the Americans for another 50. These groups did not trust each other. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and remembered different wars. The Japanese had assumed this fragmentation would make the island easy to control. They were wrong. Fertig understood something the Japanese did not. Mindanao's diversity was not a weakness. It was a reservoir of rage. The Japanese occupation had united these fractured peoples in a singular hatred. The soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army had arrived as liberators, proclaiming the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, promising freedom from American imperialism. Within weeks, they had revealed themselves as conquerors. They requisitioned rice at gunpoint. They forced laborers into construction gangs. They executed anyone suspected of disloyalty, and their definition of disloyalty was expansive and arbitrary. Village headmen were beheaded for insufficient cooperation. Women were taken. Churches were desecrated. Mosques were searched. The occupation was brutal, stupid, and comprehensive, and it created the conditions for resistance on a scale the Japanese could not imagine. But resistance without organization is merely violence, scattered and impotent. Fertig knew this. In the first weeks after the surrender, he moved through the jungle like a ghost, searching for other Americans who had refused to give up. He found them in clusters, hiding in remote barrios, living on charity and fear. There were enlisted men, junior officers, a few civilians who had worked in the mines or on the plantations. They were demoralized, sick, and convinced that the war was over. Fertig looked at these broken men and saw the nucleus of an army. He began to pull them together, one by one, appealing to duty, to pride, to the simple fact that surrender meant death or a labor camp in Japan. He told them that General Douglas MacArthur would return. He told them the Philippines would be liberated. He told them that their war was not over. Some believed him. Others simply had nowhere else to go. Then Fertig made a decision that would define everything that followed. He promoted himself. Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Fertig ceased to exist, and Brigadier General Wendell Fertig took his place. He had no authority to do this. No orders from Washington. No approval from MacArthur's headquarters in Australia. He simply declared it, had new insignia made from scavenged metal, and began introducing himself as a general officer. It was audacious, borderline fraudulent, and absolutely necessary. The Filipino guerrillas who were beginning to coalesce in the mountains did not know Fertig. They did not trust Americans who had promised to defend the islands and then abandoned them, but they understood rank. They understood symbols. A lieutenant colonel was a middle-tier officer, forgettable and limited in authority. A general was something else. A general could command. A general could coordinate. A general could be the visible embodiment of American commitment, the promise that the United States had not forgotten the Philippines. Fertig needed that authority, not for his ego, but for survival. Without it, the resistance would remain a collection of isolated bands, fighting and dying in the dark. With it, he could build something that mattered. The transformation was not immediate. For months, Fertig moved through the interior of Mindanao, meeting with guerrilla leaders, most of them Filipino officers who had refused to surrender or escaped from Japanese custody. These men were suspicious. They had been betrayed before. They had watched American generals sail away to safety, while Filipino soldiers were left to face the consequences. Fertig had to prove himself, again and again, in 100 small ways. He shared their hardships. He slept in the same mud. He ate the same rancid rice. He did not issue orders from a distance. He walked into their camps, sat with them, listened to their grievances, and slowly, carefully built a network of trust. He promised them supplies. He promised them support. He promised them that MacArthur was coming back, and when he did, the guerrillas of Mindanao would be recognized as soldiers, not outlaws. It was a gamble built on hope and willpower, and for a long time, it seemed like it might collapse under its own weight. The Japanese were not idle. They knew resistance was growing. They launched sweeps through the countryside, burning villages suspected of harboring guerrillas, executing anyone who could not prove their loyalty. The brutality was meant to inspire fear, to isolate the resistance from the civilian population. It had the opposite effect. Every burned home, every public execution, every act of casual cruelty pushed more Filipinos into the arms of the guerrillas. Farmers became intelligence agents. Fishermen became smugglers. Entire towns became part of an invisible network that fed, sheltered, and warned the resistance. The Japanese controlled the cities and the major roads. Everything else belonged to Fertig. But control without communication is fragile. Fertig needed to reach MacArthur. He needed to prove that the resistance in Mindanao was real, organized, and capable of supporting a future invasion. He needed supplies, weapons, medicine, and most of all, legitimacy. The problem was distance. MacArthur's headquarters was in Australia, more than 2,000 miles across an ocean patrolled by the Japanese Navy. There were no planes, no ships, no way to send a message except through the most primitive means imaginable. So Fertig and a small group of American engineers did what desperate men do. They built a radio. The device was constructed from scavenged parts, pieces of civilian radios, mining equipment, and improvised components hammered together in a jungle workshop. It should not have worked. The power source was unstable. The signal was weak. The atmospheric conditions over the Pacific were unpredictable. But in the autumn of 1942, Fertig's radioman powered up the transmitter and sent a message into the void. It was brief, encoded, and almost absurdly hopeful. It identified Fertig, described the resistance on Mindanao, and requested contact. Then they waited. The reply came weeks later, crackling through the static like a voice from another world. MacArthur's headquarters acknowledged the transmission. They asked for verification, for details, for proof that this was not a Japanese deception. Fertig responded with information only an American officer would know: unit designations, personnel details, geographic markers. The interrogation continued for weeks, a slow, careful dance of verification conducted across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. Finally, MacArthur's staff was convinced. The resistance on Mindanao was real, Fertig was real, and the strategic implications were staggering. From Australia, the war looked grim. The Japanese had conquered an empire in 6 months, from the borders of India to the islands of the South Pacific. The United States was clawing its way back, island by island, paying in blood for every mile. The idea that an organized guerrilla force was operating deep in Japanese-held territory, tying down enemy troops, gathering intelligence, and maintaining civilian morale was a gift beyond measure. MacArthur immediately authorized support. Submarines would be sent, supplies would be delivered. Fertig's guerrillas would be recognized as part of the United States Armed Forces in the Far East. The radio transmissions had changed everything. The first submarine arrived off the coast of Mindanao in the early months of 1943. It surfaced in the darkness, and men in small boats paddled out to meet it. The cargo was unloaded in silence. Crates of rifles, ammunition, medical supplies, radio equipment, and something even more valuable, currency. United States dollars to pay the guerrillas to buy food, to maintain the fiction that this was a professional military force and not a band of outlaws. The submarine stayed for hours, hidden in a cove, and then disappeared back into the deep. It was the first of many. Over the next 2 years, submarines would make dozens of runs to Mindanao, each one a lifeline that kept the resistance alive. With supplies came expansion. Fertig began to organize the guerrilla bands into formal military units, divisions and regiments with designated commanders, areas of responsibility, and chains of command. It was a staggering logistical challenge. The guerrillas were scattered across hundreds of miles of jungle and coastline. Communication was slow and unreliable. Many of the fighters were farmers with no military training, armed with whatever weapons they could scavenge. But Fertig imposed structure through sheer force of will. He issued orders. He established rank. He created a system of promotions and discipline. Slowly, the chaos began to resolve into something resembling an army. The intelligence network grew even faster. Fertig understood that information was more valuable than bullets. He recruited agents in every town, every port, every road junction across Mindanao. Fishermen reported Japanese ship movements. Dockworkers noted cargo manifests. Shopkeepers listened to the conversations of Japanese officers. The information flowed back to Fertig's headquarters, where it was collated, analyzed, and transmitted to MacArthur's staff in Australia. The guerrillas were not just fighting. They were watching, listening, mapping every detail of the Japanese occupation. When American forces finally returned to the Philippines, they would arrive with a comprehensive understanding of enemy positions, strength, and vulnerabilities, all provided by men and women who had never stopped resisting. But Fertig's most audacious achievement was not military. It was political. He established a functioning civil government in the territory he controlled. Courts were convened to settle disputes. Schools were reopened, teaching in defiance of Japanese edicts. Hospitals, such as they were, operated in hidden jungle clearings, staffed by Filipino doctors and nurses who risked execution if discovered. Fertig even printed currency, crude notes that bore his signature and the promise of redemption by the United States government. It was a gamble. If the Americans never returned, the currency would be worthless, a symbol of false hope. But the act of printing it, of circulating it, of treating it as real, reinforced the central fiction that sustained the resistance. The occupation was temporary. The Americans were coming back, and normal life would resume. The Japanese response was predictable and savage. They could not tolerate the existence of an alternative government. They launched offensive after offensive, sending columns of troops into the interior, burning entire villages, executing anyone suspected of collaboration. The campaigns followed a pattern. The Japanese would mass their forces, march into the jungle and find nothing. The guerrillas would melt away, carrying their weapons and supplies deeper into the mountains. The Japanese would occupy a village, declare victory, and then withdraw to the coast. Within days, the guerrillas would return, and the cycle would begin again. It was a war of exhaustion, and the Japanese were losing. The atrocities were real and deliberate. In town after town, the Japanese conducted public executions, hanging suspected guerrillas in the central plaza as a warning. They used torture to extract information, methods that left survivors broken and traumatized. They implemented a system of collective punishment, holding entire communities responsible for guerrilla activity in their area. If a Japanese patrol was ambushed, the nearest village would be burned. If a collaborator was killed, 10 civilians would be executed in retaliation. The policy was meant to sever the connection between the guerrillas and the population. It failed. The brutality only deepened the hatred, and for every fighter the Japanese killed, 2 more joined the resistance. By 1944, Fertig commanded a force of more than 30,000 fighters. It was an astonishing number, larger than many conventional armies, and it was organized across the entire island. The guerrillas controlled the countryside, the roads at night, and the flow of information. The Japanese were confined to their garrisons, unable to move without risking ambush, unable to requisition supplies without guerrilla interference, unable to govern. Mindanao had become a strategic black hole, absorbing Japanese troops and resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. Every soldier pinned down on Mindanao was a soldier who could not fight in New Guinea or the Marianas or the Philippines' main island of Luzon. Fertig's guerrillas were not just resisting, they were shaping the course of the war. The guerrilla tactics were brutally effective. Fertig's forces avoided direct confrontation with large Japanese units. Instead, they struck at supply convoys, communication lines, and isolated outposts. They ambushed patrols on jungle trails, disappeared before reinforcements could arrive, and left the Japanese chasing shadows. They sabotaged bridges, mined roads, and destroyed stockpiles. The Japanese could win every tactical engagement and still lose the strategic war, because they could not hold territory, could not secure their logistics, and could not break the will of the population. The cost was borne by everyone. Guerrilla fighters lived on the edge of starvation, subsisting on rice, root vegetables, and whatever could be hunted or foraged. Disease was rampant. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical infections killed more men than bullets. There were no antibiotics, no anesthesia, no surgical facilities. Wounded fighters were treated in jungle camps with boiled instruments and improvised bandages, and many died from infections that would have been trivial to treat in a proper hospital. The guerrillas accepted these conditions because the alternative was surrender, and surrender meant death. The Filipino civilians paid an even higher price. They were caught between 2 forces, both demanding loyalty, both willing to kill to enforce it. Families were torn apart. Fathers joined the guerrillas and never came home. Mothers hid fighters in their homes, knowing that discovery meant execution. Children carried messages through Japanese checkpoints, risking their lives for a cause they barely understood. Entire communities lived in a state of suspended terror, never knowing when the next Japanese sweep would come, never knowing who among their neighbors might be an informer. The war was not a distant abstraction. It was immediate, personal, and unending. Yet through it all, the resistance endured. Fertig moved his headquarters constantly, staying ahead of Japanese intelligence, always one step away from capture. He lived in a state of calculated paranoia, trusting no one completely, verifying every piece of information, assuming that betrayal was always possible. There were informers. There were collaborators. There were guerrilla leaders who played both sides, seeking advantage in the chaos. Fertig dealt with them ruthlessly. Traitors were executed, often publicly, as a demonstration that the resistance had rules and the will to enforce them. It was brutal, necessary, and corrosive. The moral clarity that had sustained the early days of the resistance gave way to something darker, a recognition that survival required compromise, violence, and decisions that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. In October 1944, the waiting ended. General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines. He waited ashore at Leyte, fulfilling his promise, and the liberation began. American forces landed in overwhelming strength, supported by naval bombardment, air superiority, and the detailed intelligence that Fertig's guerrillas had provided. The Japanese fought with suicidal determination, but they were doomed. The supply lines were cut. The reinforcements were not coming. The empire was collapsing. On Mindanao, Fertig's guerrillas emerged from the jungle and joined the offensive. They guided American units through the interior, identified Japanese positions, and cut off retreat routes. They were no longer shadows in the forest. They were an army, disciplined and effective, fighting alongside the conventional forces they had waited 3 years to see. The Japanese garrison on Mindanao, isolated and demoralized, disintegrated. Some units fought to the last man. Others retreated into the mountains, where they were hunted down by the guerrillas who knew every trail, every hiding place, every source of water. The occupation of Mindanao ended not with a grand battle, but with a slow, grinding collapse, as the Japanese found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, and out of options. When the war ended, Fertig was a genuine Brigadier General. MacArthur had made the promotion official, recognizing what Fertig had done not just for Mindanao, but for the entire Philippine campaign. The guerrilla networks had saved thousands of American lives by providing intelligence, securing landing zones, and tying down Japanese forces. Fertig's self-promotion, his audacious gamble in the jungle 3 years earlier, had been vindicated. But the cost was visible everywhere. Mindanao was devastated. Villages had been burned. Crops had been destroyed. Thousands of civilians were dead, executed by the Japanese or caught in the fighting. The guerrillas who survived were scarred, physically and psychologically, by years of hunger, disease, and violence. Fertig himself was exhausted, hollowed out by the relentless pressure of command. He had built an army from nothing, sustained it through impossible conditions, and delivered it intact to the moment of liberation. The achievement was extraordinary. The price was incalculable. Fertig returned to the United States, but he did not leave the war behind. The lessons of Mindanao were too valuable. The United States military studied his campaign, analyzing how a small force, properly organized and supported, could paralyze a much larger enemy. The concepts of unconventional warfare, psychological operations, and indigenous resistance that Fertig had refined in the jungle became foundational principles of American Special Operations doctrine. The Office of Strategic Services, precursor to the Central Intelligence Agency, incorporated Fertig's methods into their training. The newly formed Special Forces, the Green Berets, studied Mindanao as a model of what could be achieved when conventional military thinking was abandoned in favor of flexibility, cultural understanding, and ruthless pragmatism. Fertig himself became an instructor, teaching a generation of officers about guerrilla warfare, civil military operations, and the importance of winning the population. He was quiet about his achievements, reluctant to claim credit, aware that the real heroes were the Filipinos who had fought and died in the jungle. He knew that his role had been to organize, to inspire, to provide the structure that allowed courage to become effective. The guerrillas had done the rest. In the Philippines, Fertig was remembered differently. He was not a distant figure or a subject of academic study. He was a man who had stayed when others left, who had fought when surrender seemed inevitable, who had kept a promise that many believed was a lie. Statues were erected. Schools were named in his honor. Veterans of the resistance spoke of him with a reverence reserved for those who had shared their suffering and earned their trust. He had become part of the national story, a symbol of the alliance between the United States and the Philippines, forged not in treaties or ceremonies, but in blood, hunger, and the shared refusal to submit. Fertig lived quietly after the war, working as an engineer, raising a family, and avoiding the spotlight. He rarely spoke publicly about Mindanao. When he did, he focused on the Filipinos, on their courage, their sacrifice, and their unbreakable will. He understood that the guerrilla war had not been his victory alone. It had been a collective achievement, built by thousands of men and women who had risked everything for a future they might not live to see. His role had been to give them hope, structure, and the belief that their struggle mattered. In the end, that belief had been enough. The legacy of Wendell Fertig extends far beyond the jungles of Mindanao. His campaign demonstrated that conventional military superiority is not enough to secure victory. An occupying force, no matter how powerful, cannot survive if the population refuses to submit, and if that refusal is organized, disciplined, and sustained by external support. The Japanese had more troops, better weapons, and control of the infrastructure. They lost because they could not break the will of the people, and because Fertig gave that will a structure that could endure. The story raises uncomfortable questions that remain relevant decades later. How does an empire maintain control over a hostile population? When does resistance become effective? And when does it merely prolong suffering? What is the moral cost of guerrilla warfare, where the line between combatant and civilian disappears, and where victory is measured not in territory gained, but in the enemy's inability to govern? Fertig's campaign offers no easy answers, only the hard evidence that a determined population, properly led, can defeat a conqueror regardless of the odds. If this story moved you, if it made you think about leadership, resistance, or the forgotten corners of history, subscribe to this channel. Leave a like on this video. Share your thoughts in the comments. And here is a question worth considering. In an age of overwhelming military technology, does the story of Wendell Fertig still matter, or has modern warfare made guerrilla resistance obsolete? Your answer might reveal more about the future than the past.